Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kate Anderson. I'm the head of the Veterinary Medical Library. Glad to have you in the room here for a data management session, and we've got some folks online with us as well. So Ronnie will be monitoring chat, making sure that I don't wander too far from the podium because then people can't hear me. But I do tend to wander, so you'll have to drag me back. With me today is Noelle Capriva. She is the head of the engineering library on campus, and also Stephen Pryor is here, and he is our new digital scholarship librarian. And so when we talk a little bit about how to save your data here with MU libraries, then I might motion to Stephen to say, he will do things. He's like, what? All right, so why are we here today? So this session is to provide basically an overview of facilitating the access and reuse of your research data. You'll learn how to comply with some of the funding agency policies, create data management plans, and submit data to MOspace, our digital institutional repository. So if I could, because I know we've got kind of a mixed group in here, if you can just tell me what departments everyone is from.
Communication science and studies.
Oh, excellent.
Civil engineering.
Civil engineering, awesome.
Reference.
Reference, yay.
Personal financial planning.
Oh, great.
Biochemistry.
Biochemistry, excellent.
Political science.
Political science. Oh, ag econ. Which department are you from? Oh, AMS, excellent. So we have this wonderful wide range of data that people gather. And so when I say data, I want you to sort of plug in the kinds of things that you collect and the kinds of research that you do. Because we're here together for an hour and we have some really different disciplines in here, but hopefully we can kind of cover some different ground. Whose office looks like this? Do you know someone whose office looks like this?
I know a chemical engineering professor.
Yeah. So usually when I show this picture, people go, hey, is that so-and-so's office? Right? And so this, wow, there's a lot of messy stuff there. Is this totally organized? And it's very easy to make fun of the messy office with, can this person actually find something? And a lot of people go, yes, if that's my office, I know exactly where everything is and I can pull it. But could someone else do it? Could someone else go into your office and figure out how to get your research? Similarly, here is this lone laptop tossed to the side of the train station. This is kind of the modern day fear. Oh my God, I left my flash drive on the bus, or I washed my flash drive. I've done that several times. You think, boy, I hope this still works. So think about when we talk about managing and sharing your research data, where is your data? And have you put all of your eggs into one basket, and then what happens if you lose the basket? So what I often think about with data management is the ability to produce self-describing data sets, that these data sets can kind of live on their own without you. And why is this important? And obviously, your data are important. You've all decided that you would take an hour out of your Friday afternoons to come think about this so that the things that you collect are important to you. It's your research, it's your work. Data management important is it benefits you and your collaborators. When you're working with somebody else, can you understand their data and can they understand yours? And of course, it benefits science and inquiry as a whole. We've all heard issues about reproducibility in scientific studies, replicability in studies. So one way to help open science initiatives is making sure that you've got a data management plan and you know what you're doing with your data. And then not to put, and these are all like, these are good things. These are for the good of not only you, but the world. And well, you know what? It's also required. So depending on your funding agency, what journal you're going to be submitting to, they will have some sort of requirement for the sharing of your data. And so this is something that Noelle had found about, if you think about, well, how does data sharing and open data benefit the world? There are these great new studies now about people who are working on Ebola are sharing their data right now in real time so that it's not, well, we'll give this to you after the journal article has been published, but it is a need right now. Similarly, again, we'll talk about this a little bit more detail about your funding might depend on it if you don't have your research data freely available to other folks. You can think about that in terms of a lot of the publicly funded research. They're saying the taxpayers have funded this, so every taxpayer should be able to get to it. And I don't know if you, I know there are a few people who had signed up who were from food sciences. I don't know if they're here or online, but their very recent issue of the Cornell researcher, Stephen Wansink, who wrote that great book that I love, Mindless Eating, has had to retract several of his articles, and Cornell University said, we can't even find the original data sets, so we can't tell you if the quality of the data, if this is even correct. So think about it, it's not just for you, but it's also for your institution and how you can say, yep, this is what I am basing things on. And so you'll see a lot of different agencies have different ways of doing this. And this is some information that we've got on our data management LibGuide for you. So you can see, for example, if you look at NIH, they say, okay, if you're writing an article, you have to put it into something called PubMed Central. And then the data repository, they're like, there's multiple solutions, find out where your data is. And what you see a lot of times is, from the agency's perspective, they know exactly where they want your article to go, but then they say, and be sure your data goes somewhere appropriate. And that can be the hardest part. You're like, where is appropriate? What am I doing? And so you can see on the data repository links, even something like NSF, they literally say unappropriate repository. So we'll talk about that, about, well, how do you find an appropriate repository, or what if there's not an appropriate repository readily available to you?
That's when you start getting confused.
And so the question was about if anybody had needed to write a data management plan, and we do have someone in the room here who's already written one and trying to find out. And I don't know if you want to comment on how that went for you of writing your data management plan.
Well, I already had a sample from a previous researcher, plus, so I proposed to the MOspace repository.
Oh my gosh,
But then
we did not plant her in this room. Yes.
But then there are also specific ones for fMRI data.
Oh, sure.
Something else.
Yes, excellent. And so the response of, and this is for the folks on the phone, I know you guys can hear me, just looking at a template of a data management plan can be wildly helpful. You're like, oh, that's what I do. And then figuring out certain types of data. If you have fMRI data, it's like, yep, that's going to go in here. But if you have other things that aren't as easily knowable, then you can put it in the institutional repository and have it here with us at the libraries. So you'll see things from like the big agency perspective of you have to have your data somewhere, and more when you are writing manuscripts, you will see requirements from individual journals themselves. So this is from the Public Library of Science, or the PLOS journals. They all have this statement on here of, you have to give us your data availability statement, and it has to comply with our policies. And if you don't share your data, that can be grounds for rejection from the journal. And it is important to keep in mind that it's not that you have to share absolutely everything. For example, if you're doing anything in human subjects, you know that you're not sharing absolutely everything. You're de-identifying things, and you're sharing as much as you can and not sharing what you can't. And then, of course, not to put too fine a point on it, data management is for your own good. You know, next week you're like, what did I do? I can't remember. And so writing down how you're dealing with your data can be really important. So this is one of my favorite data management plan tweets. And this guy said, reproducibility is just collaboration with people you don't know, including yourself next week. Right? So it's like, or if you've ever come back to a project and you're like, when you're doing it, you're like, I'm going to remember what every column of this Excel spreadsheet means. No problem. And then 6 months later, you're like, I do not remember what this column means. And so often when we talk about data management, we're sort of talking about the data life cycle of planning, collecting, assuring, describing, preserving, discovering, integrating, and analyzing. And really, the plan is super important and needs to be done again and again. And don't think of like, oh, I have my data management plan, and this is for a 5-year grant, and I never have to think about it again. Revisit it every once in a while because it's going to change over the life of your project. And so here I am highlighting what the National Science Foundation does, because they have a 2-page data management plan that is required for all of their grants. And I like how they lay it out, because this can be used for any kind of data management plan that you're thinking about. So for example, what types of data do you have? Do you have physical things? So for example, our AMS colleague here, you might have actual things, right? And some people have, well, I have genetic data versus I have interview data from human subjects. It can be all over the place, or like financial data. I don't know what kind of data will you have from the finance perspective?
Well, I'm the director of the Office of Financial Success, so we're looking at analyzing longitudinal data of the success of having counseling with students over time.
Yeah. And so important to know, if you're doing any kind of longitudinal thing, what are you setting up now that's going to allow you to come back to it next year and next year and next year to look back on it? So what kinds of data do you have? What are the standards used for your data and your metadata format? This can be very specific by discipline. Are there existing standards that you need to follow? What are your policies for access and sharing? Who else is going to be able to get to this information? And think about that at different times of your study. For example, you may be like, yeah, this is just for us for a very long time, and then at the end we'll be able to share out. So you have to think about that as you go along. What are going to be your policies and provisions for reuse, redistribution, and the production of derivatives from this data? And then, near and dear to all of our hearts in the libraries, how are you going to archive this data? And how much of it are you going to archive? And how will other people be able to get into those items? Noelle has a question.
So does that mean if you're trying to make a plan, you need to specify, let's say I know that I'm going to be making spreadsheets, I'm going to save them as Excel files, and it's going to be this version of Excel. Do you need to be that specific in the data management plan?
Often in the data management plans, it's not so much that specific, that granular, because again, if you're just thinking about a 2-page management plan for a whole study, you'll be like, well, the types of data that we have are X, and we will be, I mean, a lot of people do say this will be not preserved in Excel, but this will be saved as tab delimited data so that it can be reused. And I'll show you some examples of some nice ways of people, how they use their spreadsheets for this. And then this is kind of reiterate some of these questions about what are the things you need to ask yourself before you get started at any kind of big project. What types of the data are being produced? And then very importantly, do you have the IT resources that you need? So if you're doing a lot of big scale work, or you're working on genomic stuff, or you're working on huge terabytes of information, have you contacted your IT pro to make sure that you have the computing power that you need? And how are you going to deal with your everyday computational needs versus your finalized archival needs? Can be very, very different. Again, what file formats are you going to use? Do you need special software to read this data? How are you going to, what kind of directories and file naming conventions are you going to have? And importantly, how much data are you going to produce in toto? I have a lot of folks that I talk with at the vet school, and I say, what is your data management plan? And they're like, oh, this sounds like this should be like huge, and oh my God. And I say, so do you have like a table of all of the data from all of the dogs? They're like, oh yeah, we have that. I'm like, that's your data. They're like, oh, now I know what you're talking about. So a lot of it is just demystifying a lot of times your data comes down to a spreadsheet. It's an awesome spreadsheet, but it's not like this massive thing that you're trying to corral. Who controls the data? How long do you need to keep it? Who's responsible for the data management? Where are you going to store it and back it up? Are there any privacy concerns, especially obviously if you're working with human subjects? What are your security requirements? Do you have to de-identify? And then can your data be shared? Why or why not? Metadata standards, all those kinds of things. So I took these data management plans were actually submitted. Well, luckily they took people's names off of these for this class that I was in. They were like, these are actual submitted NSF data management plans. Ready? All files will be stored on PI's secure computer. All notebook laboratories will be stored in PI's office. Does anybody see any trouble with this?
I know I'm sucking, I'm like this.
What's that?
So it's on single computer, like all the different ones.
Yeah, having your
It is crashed,
yeah.
everything gone.
Having it on one computer might not be your best option. Other problems with having this is your data management plan?
Somebody in the online asks what happens if the PI is hit by a truck.
Excellent. What happens if your PI is hit by the truck? Can you get into this secure computer? Who else has access to this? Exactly. And then here's another one. This is also straight from somebody's grant application. Data will be available to anyone who desires access to our data. When possible, data will be made available online. Problems with using this as your data management plan for, say, NSF? Noel.
Well, I mean, they're not saying how they're gonna make it available online, not clear, and there's just no way to tell how they're gonna follow up on this.
Right. Because this could very well be a legitimate data management plan in terms of, well, we have this type of human subjects data, and the only way that you can be able to get to it is literally to come to this facility in order to use it. Or we might, and if we could put this part up online on this secure website for you. But this is just a little bit vague, doesn't have quite enough detail. Because then you'll see other things like this, where this is from the Nutrient Net project, which is a big NSF project. This project will leverage existing metadata standards currently stored in ecological metadata language, EML format. So one, it's not just saying, we'll have some sort of metadata. It's actually telling you which metadata schema they're using. And then they're going to add additional entries for the arthropod community composition and arthropod stoichiometry. They're going to take field notes during the time of collection will be recorded. So they're going to have a couple of different kinds of data. And then the Morpho software will be used to generate the metadata file in EML. We choose EML format for our metadata since it allows integration with an existing data repository. So you can just see how very different this kind of level of specificity is to the other ones. And so that data management plan talks about how they're going to describe things and what kind of metadata they're going to use. Metadata is data about data, and it lets other people discuss, understand, and use your data. And the big thing to know is don't wait till the end to put your metadata on there. I have some metadata specialists in the room with me here, and you'd probably say, you want to think about it as you're going along and not just plop it on in the end. And these are all kind of the who, what, where, when, how, why of metadata, which again, a lot of this is really kind of basic, but it's like basic housekeeping, but it's very easy not to do this when you're in the throes of actually doing a project, and then later you're like, man, I don't remember what version of the software we were using. So what's the name of the data set? When did you create it? When did you last modify it? Which version of particular software did you use? Who did it? What was it sponsored by? Why were you collecting the data? Everything down to units of measure and taxonomic data. The units of measure is always a funny one because, right, didn't we crash something into Mars one time because someone was like, oh, metric. Oh, not what we were doing. So make sure everybody's on the same page of what units of measure you're using. And then also it can be very helpful to other people, right? If you're thinking about, well, data management is about describing this so that someone else can do it. If there's a problem with your data, tell other people and say, you know what, you can do these 3 things with this data, but you can't, the way that we collected this data means that you can't do this other thing that you might think to do. And also how to cite the data set so that you get credit for putting it together. And then the other tip is always use, when you can, sort of the non-proprietary format. So think about, don't want everything in just always in an Office format, but to use TXT and tab delimited format so that they can be read years later on other items. And so here is a little bit from that Nutrient Net. This is how they do their metadata. This is an excellent, well done project where they have field sites all over the world, and so they need to be very specific about, well, if person A goes and collects data from a site, everybody else needs to be able to rely on that information. So they have very strict protocols about, here's the name of the table that you're going to use for certain types of data. Here's the name of the column that you're going to use for your spreadsheet. And they even talk about, you're going to be using the tables in CSV format, not saying do this in Excel, but do it in tab delimited. And then they describe how things should be done, everything from whether something has been burned or not, you get a code to it. And then a little bit further down, they have, well, you're going to record what the precipitation is for this area, and that is defined by the mean annual precipitation in millimeters, so that everybody is on the same page when you go back and look at somebody else's data. And they've got like the elevation and the latitude, and it specifies how to collect that information. And it's just great, you've described everything and now you want to preserve it so that other people can discover it and so you can get back to it too. And this is where we'll talk a little bit about the data repositories. So someone here was mentioning earlier that sometimes there is a data repository and oh great, I have genetic data, so it's going to go into one of the NCBI databases, but you might not know where your data can go. And the big thing to think about is, well, is there already a subject-based repository for my information? That way your data is stored with similar data. Researchers in your area are kind of expecting to find it there and would be familiar with it. It might have some specialized computational tools that is useful for that type of data. And then we do have MOspace, which is the Institutional Repository for University of Missouri. This is great when a subject repository doesn't exist and you're not sure where to put something, and it preserves the links to the institution with guarantee of support from us. I was helping a faculty member a while ago, and she was having trouble on a journal page, that you have all the supplemental information on the side. And she's like, I can't find it, I can't find it, I can't find it. And so I contacted the editor of the journal. I'm like, these links are going nowhere. And he said, oh, we just keep that information for 3 years. And I was like, that's not good. That's not an archive, 3-year archive. And so hopefully they're rethinking that. But someplace putting your data with the libraries, our time horizon is much longer. We're thinking hundreds of years out, not 3 or for the life of the project. And then do think about, a lot of times people put their data in domain repositories that are based on a grant, which are wonderful, but what's going to happen to your data after the grant is over? Is that data repository actually going to be there for the long term? Or is that a time where you should actually put things in a couple of places of the domain repository so that it's with its friends and all the data is kind of similar, and then a backup copy with MOspace with us. And on our data management plan guide, we've got this list of, here are places to think about if you're submitting data. And so it's everything from data 1, which is Earth and Environmental Sciences data repositories, to Genomic Data Commons, to ICPSR, which is political science. Yes, ma'am, I got a question from the audience.
Can you save data to more than one repository, or are IP issues?
Oh, excellent question about what are the IP issues with putting your data in more than one place. So remember that the data themselves aren't copyrightable, but it is kind of the way that you're putting them together. And because you are the owner, you get to license it how you want to. And so you can say, I'm going to give the university a non-exclusive license in order to post this. Be aware of what a journal is doing, for example. How are they looking at your data? But I always see that, I don't know, I'll also ask my colleagues, Stephen and Felicity here, of if it's in a couple of places, that's better, I think. But
yes, as long as it's fixed or any updates continue to be duplicated also.
Yeah.
A caveat.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, what your versioning is. Think about your versioning. And also on this page, we've got additional information on where to find more data sets. And Google just came out with a data set search. And it's actually kind of interesting if you look to see, if you're looking to see like, well, where do data sets in my area end up? You can do some searching in the new Google data sets to see where things go. But then there's always this question of, well, I do also want to put it in the institutional repository, or I don't really, there's not really another place for it to go, but I know it needs to be open and I want other people to get to it. And so it's fairly easy to deposit data to us. Basically, it's kind of an email to get things going with the MOspace team. I think there's also an online form as well where you can kind of click on it and ask you these questions. But they're going to want to know who you are, what the project title is, what kinds of files do you have, what the file size is, if it's being deposited to another repository so that we can kind of keep track of that too. And they'll contact you about best ways to submit your data. And then it can look something like this. So this is, I got kind of a frantic email from the lead author here because he's like, oh, the journal says I have to deposit the data somewhere. Tomorrow. And I was like, oh, tomorrow. Okay. So Felicity was kind enough to help me with this researcher of basically kind of, it was a very simple spreadsheet about what are the values that you have for all of these dogs. Dogs are great in that there's no sort of privacy issues with dogs, so I did not have to help him de-identify any of these pups. And then we were able to basically put the information into MOspace and say what it's connected to, that this is part of this journal article. And then in the journal article, then it links back to MOspace where it says the supplemental data is available here. Yes, Stephen.
I will point out that this example, the attached file, looks like it's a PDF.
Yes.
Which may not be the best way to do it for reuse.
Yes.
Why? I thought PDFs were forever.
Well, in terms of fixing something in a particular format, or
Here, Stephen, I'm going to come here, Stephen.
Yeah, so I pointed out for the online audience that the PDF format is here in the example and might not be the best format for data submission. And then somebody else said, well, I thought PDFs were forever. Well, so the point of a PDF is to kind of fix a document in a specific sort of format. And with data, unless you do it the right way, it really limits your ability to copy and paste or do operations, actually use the data. You might be able to look at it with your eyes and retype it by hand if you want.
Introduce an error into
Yes, so there are problems with PDFs.
Yes, thank you. And it's very funny that Stephen brings this up because I said, hey, give me a text, just give me a text file of this. And the faculty member was, I want to make it just a little bit hard for people to use my data. And I was like,
Oh.
okay, so we have complied with the letter of the law, but not necessarily the spirit of the law. But I do think, sharing your data is kind of this new thing that some people are like, great, here, I'm going to give you all my tools. I put my code on GitHub, have at it, find something great and new with it. Other people are like, here, read my data. You can read it from here, can't you? It's like, well, so I think that will continue to change and evolve over time. And I had once given a similar talk to this, and it was great. There were graduate students, and they were like, okay, yep, we're going to need to. Well, at first they're like, no, we don't need to do this. And the faculty member said, then you won't get published, and then you won't graduate. And then you're here. And someone said, well, I could probably understand your data, but I don't know if you could understand mine, because mine is super special. And it's like, well, how? But it goes back to the metadata issue of, well, how are you describing it? Can someone else actually take it and run with it? And are you putting it, as Stephen is mentioning, are you putting it in a format that so someone else can do something with it? And then for those of you who are need to write data management plans, it goes back to this issue of, so what do you put in your data management plan? If you're going to use MOspace, what do you put in your plan in order to do that? And so we've got some basically things you can cut and paste from our website on the data management plan LibGuide that basically says, okay, this type of data is going to be deposited into MOspace, and it's a digital institutional repository. It's going to have metadata, and now we can assign DOIs to your particular item, and that they'll be freely available. Also know that you have 2 pages a lot of times in a data management plan, and some people are like, I do not want to take up 10 lines with that. And so a lot of people cut this down to, this type of data is going to be deposited in the University of Missouri Institutional Repository. And those are they're known enough around the country and with different scientists that people are like, yep, that is a stable thing. And then this kind of comes back around to, so think about the licensing. How do you want other people to use it? They've got some attribution licenses for data and data sets, basically so you can tell people, hey, go ahead and do these kinds of things with it. And then I always want to plug ORCID. How many of you in this room have an ORCID ID? Oh my God, I'm so proud. Wow, that is fantastic. So what an ORCID ID does for you is allows you to connect all of your work together. It's great. If we have grad students in the room, it's a really wonderful way at the beginning of your career to kind of establish this numerical ID and then say, here are the journal articles that I've based, that I have written, here are the data sets, I can connect those, I can connect my conference proceedings so that you have them all together. My name is Kate Anderson. There is more than one at this university, so it's also a way to help other people. Oh, this is the Kate Anderson that works on this versus a different Kate Anderson. Or if your name changes for whatever reason, everything is connected under one number so it can all be pulled. You'll see this more and more and more and more and more when you submit to journals. A lot of journals now just require this of, okay, what is your ORCID ID? Some journals even require it if you are being a reviewer. And so they want to establish that information, but it's a really nice thing to have for those of you who are graduate students and you do your thesis. We'll put the ORCID ID on there, correct? Yes, so ORCID IDs are required for our graduate students. And then hopefully you'll use that over your entire career and be able to add things to that. Here are some of the resources. And I think we'll probably have time. I can go to some of these, especially the data management plan one. Yes, Felicity, come to the microphone and speak.
I want to talk about MOspace and your other options.
Sure.
Because you might work with researchers at other places.
Some other institutions have specific. Oh, is the microphone over here? So some other universities have separate data repositories where they require data. So I just, in case you talk to people at other places, I just want to make sure it's clear here what our practice is. As Kate mentioned, is we're encouraging people to put your data with your discipline, with the idea that it will be found more and used by your colleagues. So MOspace is an option. I think it was a good question. You can put it in both places. But I just wanted to let you know, if you talk to colleagues at other places, that some places are treating it differently. So MOspace, we work with Do It too. So we haven't gotten any, but we've had questions about terabytes of data. So we have a partnership with Do It where we would work with them to make sure we could provide access to that data.
I think I want to pull this particular one up. So all of the information that we've been talking about today, you can find much of it here on our data management LibGuide, libraryguides.missouri.edu/data management. And it gives you some just basic resources on what is data management, where can you go to find out more, and also it has the links to the funding agency requirements about data management, and then the best practices. I think it's probably can be the most useful, just again, those questions to think about, and then looking at other examples can be super useful. And so the data management tool is a free tool from California Digital Library, and they have great things by funding agency. So this can be helpful if you're going into a slightly different area, or it's a different directorate, then you want to see, well, is there something that's slightly different about that? And that we've got some examples for you as well, because that can be if you've never done one, then that can be kind of the hardest thing to do. And then if you do need help with the data management plan, several of us in the libraries are happy to take a look at your data management plan to make sure that you've kind of hit the highlights. That NSF information that I was showing you, it doesn't say you have to do things in that particular order, and so some people write them very differently, but we can go over any plan that you have to make sure that you've hit all of the areas. And sometimes it can be nice to have a complete outsider read your data management plan. It's like, I have no idea what you're talking about here. Would the people reviewing this know what you're talking about? These data management plans are peer reviewed by the particular agency, so you want to make sure that they would understand what you're talking about. And then we also have the list of data repositories that might be of use to you, and then information on how to submit to our institutional repository. I think, oh, we have plenty of time for questions. Yes, and I'm going to have you come up and speak into we get our exercise now. We can come and say hello to the audience.
I have a question about hard copies. So I have questionnaire data, and so the numbers go into a spreadsheet, but these data come from hard copies. So I guess the question is about how long do I keep these hard copies? Do I have to keep them, etc.?
I will ask you questions. Okay. In your field, are there any sort of retention guidelines of these need to be kept 10 years past the end of the project? Kind of like, I'm thinking like your taxes. It's like, all right, you've got them plus 7 years.
Right.
Or these have to be kept always, or is it that once the project is done, then, and you have verified that it's correct? Yeah. That's always the problem, like transcribing from a hard copy in.
Yeah. I mean, the IRB protocol also.
Yes.
Has to be described for how long you will keep the data. So, I mean, there's, I guess, a minimum limit of keeping them. And I know that, but I guess it's more like beyond, like, can I keep them indefinitely? Should I? Etc.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to ask Felicity, what she thinks of this question. In some ways, the actual hard copies, people do keep them for the longest time, and that you want to, I always think the question for me would be, basically, what is the worst that can happen? If someone who should not get to those notebooks do, how will that affect your research or the people that you were, that's based on that? Like, how secure do you need these items to be? Often it's...
We do it. I mean, there's one side is how long is the grant required?
Yeah.
And then the other side of, will this be useful for researchers in the future?
Yes.
Regardless of what the grant requires. So it probably does require thinking of your discipline and your specific study and how that information can be used in the future in the field.
Right. And also, how expensive is it for you to keep that data? And it's very different, like if you are thinking about, oh, well, it's only 4 notebooks. How many of you have 4 notebooks that you have moved? You know, every time you move, okay, I have all of these. Versus when you do have like huge data sets, and IT all of a sudden is saying, we're actually charging you monthly for this. Sometimes people make very different decisions very quickly of, you know what? It's after the grant, and I no longer am going to pay the $100 a month to keep the electronic data. But you might be like, well, and I don't know what other discoveries can come from this, the physical copy. That's what you're thinking about in terms of the future. I don't know if our classicists in the room are like, save it forever, because right, like 200 years from now, someone comes along and finds a research notebook. Hey, you know, that's kind of cool. Yeah, Noelle.
So my question would be, I just wonder about,
It's kind of a non-answer to your question.
I guess I would wonder, depending on your field, if the questionnaire is unique to your study. It seems to me it's not. Is it an instrument that's widely used? So that would also make a difference, I think, because when I'm looking at stuff related to libraries, a lot of times the questions, the surveys that are done are specific to that study. So I might want to see the original data for those reasons, the questions and the answers together. But if it's a widely used instrument, that would affect your decision as well, I would think.
I mean, I guess that these questionnaires have raw data, and then in my Excel sheet, it's just a total score or a subscale score.
Oh.
You know what I mean? I mean, in that sense, maybe someone's interested going back to the raw data.
Yeah, I think that is a big difference. Whether you and you know, I work with a lot of folks who do genetic data, and they're doing these reads. So the question is, as we're asking her more information about her data, she's saying that the notebooks and the print copy actually is the raw data, where her Excel is the counts. So it's not actually a complete duplicate of one another. And so think about, well, what else might be done with that raw data in a different way later. Might encourage you to keep it longer. But again, you know, depending on the discipline, you might be like, yeah, no, nobody keeps these, you know, or like, okay, I can do that. And if you're working, and again, in the folks that I work with more genetic data, they're thinking more about how much is this costing me to save it versus how much would it cost me just to run the experiment again. And it's like, oh, and actually there is now a better way to do this experiment on, so my husband is a plant biologist. He's like, oh yeah, we get kind of the finalized data, make sure everything is okay, and then we dump those huge reads. One, because they're huge and you would need to pay to keep them, and that 6 months from now, he still has the plant, and so he can just rerun the experiment. So his raw data is the plant. Another question.
I just was curious if you wanted to address that. I think you call it de-identifying data.
Oh, yes.
I mean, is there anything other than standard IRB processes and or whatever your grant may say? Does MOspace have some procedural requirements?
There's some good software on campuses. Question about how to de-identify data. I don't know if you've ever used, do you use RedCap when you do? So there is a software product called RedCap that will help with the de-identification of individuals. We don't do any of that additional work. We take what you give us as, all right, you say you want us to post this, so then we're going to post that. But I can give you some resources from more of the human subject side of what they use, so that you can kind of see how to blur stuff a little bit. I had gotten a question, because I talked about how, the dogs don't have to de-identify them, but I did work with a faculty member to basically blur where exactly a study site was, because it would have identified the farm. And he was like, I can't identify the farm. And so how do you work with some GPS data that isn't quite exact? So yeah, there's some interesting ways to do it. I can get you some more exact information. And there's always the question of, and this is, I think it's every researcher's nightmare of someone figures out who your subject is, right? When you can see that, oh, well, you told me how old they are, you told me where they live, you told me this about them, and you told me that about them. If I know enough information, could I actually figure that out? Yes, a question.
I actually remember, well, it's pretty famous within the nerd community, the story of...
Come in. Nerd story coming up. We love nerd stories.
Hi. Well, I actually remember a story from the nerd community where it was a case where someone did not blur out the data correctly. Basically, it was this company trying to justify that they were accused of basically letting a sexual harasser remain on the team. So like, no, we didn't. We fired this person. So they showed a transcript of their chat log, and they tried to blur it out, but they didn't blur out enough. Like, they kept the name the same length, and if you look at it close enough, you could see the J. So people were able to identify that person within like a couple of hours. So it's really important that you not only do it, but you do it properly, because if there's a flaw in how you do it, it can completely negate the entire point of it.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
This is question about, like, I have some data which I kept in the network drive as well as on my computer. So is it okay, or we have to keep it on 3 different computers or 4 different computers?
Excellent question. This is like, okay, I know I shouldn't keep it in one place. Does that mean I have to keep it in 1,000 places? And my question would be, how is that network drive backed up? And then is that network drive controlled by your college's system, where they go through? Because I know, like, I'm at the vet school, and on my network drive, if I delete something accidentally, I can call them and say, hi, can you find the previous copy? What's the last copy that you can get for me? So the question isn't necessarily, oh good, it's in 2 places, but it's like, well, what's the backup systems for those places?
Centralized.
Yeah, centralized. Perfect. Yeah. And so, and I guess you can always ask them about, what is the backup schedule for this particular folder, and is it adequate for what the project that you are currently doing? Because sometimes, if you're working on stuff and you're like, oh gosh, this only gets backed up, this particular area only gets backed up every week, okay, that's fine. But if it's any longer than that, I'm going to lose, if there was a catastrophic failure, am I going to lose too much of that?
So if I have also in the box, so there is a problem.
See, now you've got 3 things already. Like, you've also got it on box storage. Yes.
Yes. So there is a problem with the box now that it has been moved to different ways. Like, we cannot see a real time different computers.
Oh. That I would kick your question back over to your IT pro to see. And I know there was talk at one time of Box, that the university no longer supporting Box. I can't remember. They were going to go to some other OneNote. Was that? Do you remember that? But again, I think it goes back to Stephen's point of knowing which version is where, because that's where you can be like, oh, my Box account is now 3 behind, and what is the system for making sure everything is on the current one, and what is considered a final version of, like, okay, this is actually what got submitted to a journal, and this is the portion of it that I need to share, which can be very different from your sort of working documents.
Suppose you are submitting document to MOspace. So
Yes.
is it immediately available to the public, or if it is not published and I'm submitting to
Oh,
MOspace?
great question about availability of items in MOspace. And so I'm going to have Felicity come up and answer that question. Can you embargo items in MOspace?
Well, for most things, we add them to MOspace immediately and then they're available. There are instances with theses and dissertations where there's holds on things. So
And you can set those embargo dates, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll work with people to make sure we're meeting what your needs are.
Other questions? Concerns? Yes. Come on up.
Just sort of occurred to me, sort of building on that, there are sometimes when archives are deposited, paper archives, they might be an embargo for, till after the death of certain key figures, and or whether that's sort of whether there are, I suppose that would be easy enough to implement on MOspace as well.
Yeah, so the embargoes, I mean, you can set different embargoes, correct? And then the question, like if you're doing a data management plan, someone might push back on that and say, well, why does it need to be embargoed until that date? And there are totally legitimate reasons for that. There was a kind of a Twitter fight about a Nature researcher who did not, like Nature's like, you have to give your data. And he's like, not done with it yet. I need my grad student to get this. And the other people in the community are like, not a good enough reason. But that could be very different from this person has given us her working papers and under the agreement that they will be embargoed until a certain date. This is fun. It's like a Rubik's Cube.
So well, maybe Felicity can back up, but the question might have been about an ambiguous embargo end date, because I noticed you said this item has an agreement that it's embargoed until 5 years after somebody dies or something like that. A lot of the embargoes that we do in MOspace is based on an end date. We ingest the material, we set that date on it, and it automatically comes up. I don't.
It'd be harder.
I don't know if at the moment we have any kind of way to set a Google Calendar reminder or to keep up with when somebody dies or something like that. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because MOspace, our whole idea is open access, making things available. So yeah, that long-term one might be more of a challenge.
Yes.
Where you could send it when you were ready to make it available. Yeah. Yeah, because most of the things we are holding are for 1 year or 2 years. Good point.
Anything else? And that's come down.
Yes.
I guess I just want to point out, I think with Kate here and the others, that you know that the libraries, we have this whole team of people ready and willing to help you, from Kate, who's a real expert, and Noelle on where to put things and data management plans, to having a place to put your data. And Stephen is new on the team as a digital scholarship librarian. So we really are working to help the university in this whole area. So and Kate has really been great on helping to build some of this.
It takes a village, is what we say. And also because we are in contact a lot of times with the Cyber Infrastructure Council, because there's some issues that are like a little bit bigger than just like our repository, but it is just research computing in general. And then we have connections too with the OSPA, so all of the Office of Research folks too, to make sure that what is in compliance and how can we help people get into compliance with various things. So, but yeah, it's a good place to end unless anybody has anything else. But just know that hopefully what we've shown you is that we've got a lot of resources for you, And if you have a question, just ask one of us. And then if we're not exactly the right person to help you, then we'll figure out who the right person is and get your questions answered. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm glad you all came. You're welcome.